Hey everybody, welcome back to Corporate Law 101, an entrepreneur's guide. We're now starting section 2, part 1 on shares. And before we go too far, let me talk to you a little bit about what we're going to learn here in the next section, okay? First of all, we're going to learn about shares and shareholders. What are shares? How do the owners get those shares? Things of that sort, okay? The next thing is the stock ledger. This is probably one of the most important documents that the corporation has. It is the ledger, literally the legal documentation of who the owners are, how many shares there are, when they were issued, how they were issued, what was the capital given for those shares, things of that sort. And we'll go into great detail on that. To me, this is probably where the real meat of the value of the operation here is. This is what you paid the big money to learn. And then we'll also talk about stock warrants and stock options. Okay, and a warrant is basically given to an outsider to the company to allow them to purchase shares of the company for a value, as well as an option is for generally insiders. And there's a couple of ways that happens, and we'll talk about that as part of the overall development here. Okay, a corporation is a structure and is probably the most advantageous way to start a business, primarily because it creates a real separation between your personal assets and your business assets. It forms a business operation that declares the business as a separate legal entity guided by a group of what are called fiduciaries. It's a big word that basically means they have to keep your best interests in mind, which is known as the board of directors. Okay? Now, corporations issue shares, which are issued for sale to raise share capital. A share is a unit of ownership interest in a corporation that provides for equal distribution of any profits, if they are declared, and they're generally paid out in the form of what are called dividends. There's two basically main kinds of shares. There's common shares, which are the majority of shares that you would know, and then there are preferred shares, and we'll kind of go into the difference on those. Physical stock certificates now have really been replaced by electronic shares, so that, like a mutual fund will send you a recording of the electronically amount of shares that you own in a particular corporation. The owner of the shares in the corporation is a shareholder or a shareholder of the corporation. They have, by the way, a shareholder does not have any duty to each other. So one shareholder can try to screw another shareholder. They do not have any fiduciary relationship between themselves. The board of directors, on the other hand, has a direct fiduciary duty to protect the owners of the company and to do the best they can for the owners of the company. A share basically is an indivisible unit of capital expressing the ownership relationship between the company and the shareholder. It's a fancy way of saying it tells me how much shares you own and how much power you have within the company. Okay, let's talk a little bit about shareholders and members. Shareholders are in corporations. Members are in LLCs, as we talked about in the earlier section. Okay, well, I want to make a clarification here before we go too far. In talking about the shareholders versus members here, the shareholders and members are very important differences. A shareholder here is a corporation. A member is an LLC, if you remember from our previous discussions. A shareholder has stock. A member has member units. Okay, equity interest units in the LLC. A members agreement is controlled by an LLC operating agreement. Okay, where a corporation is going to be handled via an agreement between the shareholders called a shareholders agreement, which we went through in our earlier processes as well. Basically, shares are issued units of the corporation that represent the ownership in a corporation, and they provide the equal distribution of any profits. Now, in a corporation, those must be equal. In an LLC, they can be unequal. So, for example, if I make $100 in a corporation and there's 10 people, each one of them must get $10 in dividends is the way they're paid. In an LLC, one member could receive all of the loss of the company and another member receive all of the gain of the company. So it's very important that you understand whether you're an LLC or a member shareholder before you proceed. And the flexibility is in the members' LLCs, no questions about it, but it is much more logical. And for example, venture capitalists are generally not liking of member LLCs. They like shareholder, generally C or S corporations, as we've talked about before. When establishing a corporation, the owners choose basically between, as we said, common stock or preferred stock. And most companies issue common stock. The stock basically benefits the shareholders through appreciation in the value of the stock and dividends, making the common stock riskier than preferred shares, because preferred shares have a preference in their payments. They are paid before any of the common shares are paid. Common shares, however, also come with voting rights, where preferred shares generally don't. Giving a shareholder voting rights allows them to have more control over the business, and they can put groups of shares together to create basically groups of shares that can vote as blocks of shares and have influence over the management of the corporation. And also in some of the common shares, you have what are called preemptive rights. And preemptive rights are the rights that ensure that a shareholder can buy new shares and retain their percentage of ownership when the corporation issues new stock from the corporation. Now, the goal here is to try to collect the controlling interest, because the controlling interest gives that shareholder or a group of shareholders significant influence over the actions of the company, and then generally will allow them to elect the board of directors, and then the board of directors would elect the officers of the company, and then the officers would, of course, manage the company on a day-to-day basis. And so the influence is quite a bit there if you can get the right people to manage the company. The controlling interests are there, however, only so long as the shareholders maintain that, let's call it 60-40 relationship. If it suddenly swings 60-40 the other way, they would be minority shareholders. And by the way, minority shareholders have significant rights in almost every state in the United States. So you've got to be very careful. You have to treat minority shareholders the same way you treat the majority shareholders. You cannot violate their rights, or you're going to end up getting sued by them along the way. Okay, let's talk a little bit about now some things that we call authorized shares. Authorized and issued, and we're going to talk about those here, authorized versus issued, okay? And authorized shares they comprise the total number of shares a company's board of directors may issue, and there's generally the amount that was given to the Secretary of State of the state of incorporation as the total authorized shares. So let's just say that you authorized 1,000 shares. 1,000 shares. You may only issue 200 shares. That means there's 800 shares. In this case, 800 shares are in treasury. Okay? So in treasury, these 800 shares do not vote. So the 200 is 100% of the issued, but it's only 20% of the authorized. That's going to become important when we start doing the mathematics here. And by the way, again, the system that we're using does a lot of the math for us. So as you can see on this particular thing, we already know how many total shares there are, what the percentage ownership here is, what the authorized shares are, things of that sort, okay? Certificate numbers are very important, so you know which owners have which shares. And the identity of the issued shares, the returned shares, and the lost shares has to be exact so that you know who has rights to vote at the shareholder meeting. And then the shares owned by the shareholder or members can be dilutable or non-dilutable. What does that mean, dilutable or non-dilutable? Well, dilutable basically is the reduction of ownership percentage of a share caused by the issuance of new shares. So if I have a non-dilutable share and I own, let's just say, 3% of the company, when the company issues new shares, I have to be adjusted so that I continue to own 3% of the shares. Most shares, in fact, almost all shares, are dilutable shares, and that is that they can be diluted down. So you may own 100% on Monday, you sell 50% to Jones on Tuesday afternoon, you own 50% of the shares. If Jones sells his to someone, or you issue more shares to someone, if Joe sells his shares to someone, it doesn't change the ownership percentages because there were no new shares added. If the company adds new shares, however, then it would dilute you again below the 50% and Joe below the 50%. So I hope that makes sense. I have talked now for some time about dilutable and not dilutable stock, okay? Both dilutable and non-dilutable. But I really haven't done a good job, I don't think, about talking about what dilution is. Dilution is a reduction in the ownership percentage of a share of stock caused by the issuance of new shares. So if the company issues new shares, the other shares in the company must dilute or go down, okay? Dilution can occur when holders of stock options, such as company employees or holders of options or warrants, and we'll get into that in our next section, exercise those options or warrants. When the number of shares outstanding increases, each of the existing shareholders automatically owns a smaller or diluted percentage of the company, making each share logically less valuable. The logic is that you should be getting more value from the people who are buying in, namely, in this case, let's just say the warrant holder was an employee. That employee worked and made value for the company and is now being issued shares in the company, which diluted the company shares, but the value of the company actually went up because of the work done by the party that exercised the shares. Dilution is a case where a company is divided into smaller pieces, meaning that the current investors have a smaller portion of the overall pie. While it primarily affects company ownership, dilution also reduces the value of the existing shares by reducing the stock's earnings per share. That's why a lot of public companies calculate both earnings per share and diluted earnings per share, which takes into account all the options and other what they call dilutive securities that are in the company. Now, share dilution can happen at any time the company needs additional capital, because new shares are issued on the public markets or sold to investors in some form. The potential upside of the share dilution is that the capital that the company receives from selling the shares, as I said, improves the company's profitability and therefore the value of its stock. However, share dilution is not normally viewed as favorable by existing shareholders because their value of their shares is perceived to have gone down. And that's why companies sometimes initiate share repurchase programs to help curb dilution, allows the company to bring in shares from at a little higher price, but then be able to sell those shares along the way. So I hope that is a little more helpful on the share dilution portion of this. So you sometimes hear authorized shares here are interesting because some of them call them outstanding shares, and that's all the shares of the corporation that have been authorized, issued, and purchased by investors. And some people call it a fully diluted table. There's all kinds of different words for it. It's full disclosure of all the authorized shares, which it was the total amount you can give. If you give 1,001 shares, you go to jail. It's fraud. Okay. If you have issued shares, then you have to know who they were issued to and how. And then, of course, this ties into your cap table or your capitalization table. And that is, how did you get the dollars, the value for those 200 shares? Where did that come from? And that's going to go on our stock ledger when we get to that. Outstanding corporate shares are shares that are issued and sold to investors from the available number of authorized shares, and they're known as outstanding shares. The total number of outstanding shares cannot be greater than the total number of authorized shares. As I said, that's fraud. And those are laid out, of course, in the Articles of Incorporation with the State Secretary of State. That pretty much now tells us a lot about the shares. And at this point in time now, we're going to end this session, and then we'll go over and talk about now how we get to ownership of those shares that we just issued. And those people that own those shares are called shareholders. So we'll come right back after these messages. That's what you always say on TV. It just sounds pretty good to me. We'll be back in a few minutes with now more information on shareholders. Thank you. And that's it for now for this tutorial. These tutorials are copyright 2017 BrainTech CSI Inc., all rights reserved.